people in.
Radio.
Admit everybody. So people will start coming in. Let's have a look. Admit everyone. Here we go. Morning, Kevin. Good morning, Steve. Good morning, Stuart. Good morning, Kate. Morning, Carey. Morning, Philip. Good morning, Alexander. Just admitting some last-minute people. And thanks everyone for joining this morning. Let's just keep admitting. If you have just joined, if you could go on mute, that would be fantastic to open the floor readily for Margaret. So Phil, I'm going to mute you. So there's always one, isn't there, Phil? Allowing Margaret to talk, which is great. So we're admitting Henry. Good morning, Jackie. Good morning, Simon. We'll be playing your, might be playing your video later, Simon. So woohoo! There you go. There you go. Let's just admit a few more. Okay. If you have just joined, if you could go on mute, that would be great. Submit Henry. If you have just joined, if you could mute, that would be great. That one and admit. There we go. Good. Go. Morning, Matthew. And good morning, Johnny. There we go. Excellent. Okay. Well, it's now 10:33. Welcome everybody to this week's Pension Playpen Coffee Morning. We're delighted that Margaret Snowdon OBE will be giving us an update on anti-scamming, and really looking forward to this. It impacts everybody in the UK, and no doubt Margaret's got some stats and some updates for you. But if you'd like to ask Margaret a question, then please raise a hand at any point. I know Margaret's always very happy to answer any questions, and we'll open the chat as well. If anybody's got any links or any comments that they want to make in the chat, we'll open that up. We are being recorded as well, so Simon, Phil, Kate, Jackie, everybody happy that we're being recorded. Margaret's very happy with that as well. So without any further ado, I will pass over to Margaret. So thank you very much indeed, Margaret, and good morning. And you're on mute, Margaret, sorry.
I followed orders and went on mute immediately when you said it. So there we go. It's been quite a morning. I gave Steve a bit of a heart attack almost, I think, when I didn't dial in until, you know, on the nose at 10:30 because my PC decided to do a reboot just at the worst time possible. But it's not true that it's steam generated, but yes, it does struggle a little bit from time to time. But anyway, onwards and upwards. I'm probably not going to give you lots of stats. If you want them, I can certainly provide them. I don't particularly want to bore you. I mean, I'm conscious that, you know, most people around this session have heard me speak about scams before, so it will be slightly repetitive, but hopefully questions will keep it interesting. I also see I've got a couple of my gifted colleagues from PSIG on the call, and I'm sure they can supplement what I say, or in fact challenge me if I'm wrong. But let's sort of kick off. And the first thing I thought I would actually cover is what is a scam, because I think that the heart of a lot of the difficulties we have is where does a pension scam start, and importantly, where does it finish? So I thought I'd just remind everyone that it's actually an offer which involves deception, misrepresentation, or omission, and importantly, to encourage movement of money from an authorised pension scheme to an unauthorised one, or to a bogus one, or to a scheme with lots of fee layering and fake investments, and it targets the member. But it's not, you know, some of its cousins, like a two-stage scam, where somebody transfers and then, you know, immediately hops from that into something else that becomes a scam. It's not a secondary scam where there's a complaint about the transfer, and it's not a direct investment scam where people take their own money and put it into an investment. And it's also not bad financial advice, and it's not about decision regret. It really is about people transferring money from a pension to somewhere basically they shouldn't. And if I look back, in the old days, we tended to, just pay transfers, and we didn't think a lot about it. We had no real concerns. And we didn't actually even think about whether we were making statutory transfers or discretionary ones until we had the rise of the professional scammer, as I call them. And I think the PSIG code, going back to 2015, helped a lot. And I think we were doing pretty well until we were hit by the Hughes case, where the statutory right overrode a duty of care. And that, I think, really blew everybody's confidence. And we started then recalibrating the transfer risks. But what I wanted to talk about was the 21 transfer regulations and the guidance from PSIG that's due to come out. And I thought I'd set the scene by asking a question. Well, it's a rhetorical one, but really, what did we want from regulations? Well, we wanted a power to stop transfers of concern where a statutory right forced them through, despite warning signs. And what did we get? Well, we got the power to stop transfers of concern where statutory right forced them through despite warning signs. So we got what we asked for. But what's the problem? Well, I think the problem comes down to a couple of assumptions or expectations. And firstly, I would say there was an assumption that schemes were already carrying out scams due diligence. We thought that most schemes were applying the code, and therefore the regulations wouldn't add an extra burden. There was also an assumption that if flags throw up false positives, i.e. scam signs unnecessarily, that schemes could always choose to pay under discretion. And that meant we had an assumption that all schemes have rules that allow them to make discretionary transfers. And the regulations only impact the statutory right. And it's a bit of an obvious comment, but schemes can't choose to break the law, and they can't choose to not comply with their scheme rules. And finally, we've got a couple of regulations that were probably a little bit too enthusiastic, a little bit broadly defined, which has caused considerable debate in the industry. And those are the obvious overseas investments one, which generates an amber flag, and incentives to transfer, which generates a red flag. But also we've got a slight gap with overseas residency and overseas advice, which sort of falls outside of the regulations anyway. But the good news is DWP is reviewing. They're due to complete that, I think, by May, and I'm sure John can correct me if that's wrong, but I would expect a report maybe by the summer. And there's a lot of input being taken from the industry, and I think it's pretty well progressed. So, well, where are we now? It's quite an interesting space. When I started looking at the regulations, I thought it would all be nice and easy. But where we are now is a bit odd. We've got fewer transfers, but we've got some increases in access to funds. And I think the fewer transfers isn't really because of the regulations. A lot of it's because of the economy. Transfer values are lower than they were. People have got their mind on other things, and the cost of living crisis is an impact. But we've also got more vulnerable members because there's a bit of urgent need. And what that does is it drives scammers, it drives bad acts and bad actors. And it's actually quite easy for scammers to get at our members, partly because of online advertising, which we would like to see an end to, but it's going to take a little bit longer than we'd hoped. And because of things like community infection, and that might not be the right word, but we have a lot of word of mouth. We have factory gating, where a scammer gets hold of somebody, they often then get hold of their friends and family. And also we have an issue because the gap in communications between us and our members leaves a bit of a space for social media and scammers. And despite everything I think we're seeing and reading, scams are still a small minority of all transfers. But I think the broad flags have probably skewed the picture a little bit, and we suddenly think scams are everywhere. We've got delays in transfers, which is a bit worrying, particularly as the majority of transfers are generally fine. Referrals to Money Helper are taking quite a long time, adding to those delays. But also we've got some increased admin costs and a real fear of getting it wrong. And I have actually heard a rumour that there might be a little bit of cussedness and making it as awkward as possible. Now, I wouldn't like to think that was anybody around this session at all, but it is worrying when I hear things like that. But everybody's looking for an answer, and that's understandable. PSIG is also looking for an answer. We're looking for common good practice when there isn't actually a great deal of example at the moment. And actually, even yesterday, some new thinking started to emerge on MAPS referrals. So it's a bit of a moving feast. Makes it very interesting, but makes it difficult to do anything about. So why are we publishing guidance? I've been asked this question quite a lot, actually, because it's not what we normally do. Although I have to point out that practitioner guidance is one document within the code. But because of being in a bit of a quandary, do we reflect the law and stop or delay most transfers, or do we go for a pragmatic approach and put the risk back on trustees and members? And using guidance, we thought, allowed us to steer a bit of a course between the two. And we've made it interim because we appreciate that we're expecting some further clarification of the regulations in due course. But I must say the toing and froing, the number of iterations, the consultation, everything we've done around an interim guide, which I must admit I thought would be quite easy, meant that my consumption of biscuits has probably quadrupled over the period. And I'll stop there for a minute, just in case there are any questions. I've got a limited view of what's going on, but I don't think anybody's got their hand up. No.
We've got some comments already. I think one from Phil. Phil, do you want to unmute and just actually ask your question? I think that would be a good idea.
Sure. This may lead into a wider discussion. I'm still perplexed at the number of schemes and trustees that don't do something to actually appoint an IFA. The number of schemes that we're still seeing who just think it's the safest thing for them to do is to just send a member off to unbiased.co.uk and let them sort it out themselves. And the situation is just getting worse because we are seeing at Guide, we are actually seeing decent IFAs who are actually leaving the market because of PI issues. And we've certainly seen in the last few months a number of IFAs who have actually gone to the wall, not even just down to British Steel. So I'm still perplexed why why trustees don't do something.
Well, I'll kick off on an answer on that, and there may well be a few views around the call, but there is a capacity issue apart from anything else. And you said yourself, Philip, that some are exiting the market. It is actually quite hard to choose a good IFA, and I did actually specifically refer to bad advice not being in our bailiwick, because the FCA is responsible for the quality of advice by advisors, but it is actually quite expensive. Trustees have to select, and a lot of trustees are a bit concerned that if they select an IFA, that somehow they're on the hook, and they're part of the process if things go wrong and we get complaints. So while I agree, I think it would be good if there was a captive, gold star IFA attached to a scheme or a provider to allow members to go there. I just suspect that practically implementing it is actually quite a challenge, but I'd be interested in any other thoughts from anybody. Simon, you've got your hand up.
Yeah, just on that. Sorry, yeah, just on that point, I think it's a really interesting point. Is why did there seem to be this lack of IFAs, or why are trustees not signing these IFAs up? When you consider that with the rush to de-risking and buyout and all these kind of other things, I'm seeing schemes are tending to put in IFAs in place for those processes. Maybe that's because it's a defined period of time. They go, well, we'll just have them in for 2 years. They'll often subsidise that cost, maybe completely or partly, for a member going through those de-risking processes. And yet, as Philip says, we don't see the same. I appreciate it's not, those IFAs are not necessarily 100% crossover in terms of what they're authorised to do, but there must be a considerable crossover. It's interesting that they don't seem to be putting them in place for the particular issue of scams. I just wonder if it's because they go, well, once we put them in place, we have to keep that process going for the life of the scheme, and that's a considerable cost. I don't know.
Good point. We've got a couple of other comments. Alexander, I think you've put your hand up a couple of times and I've missed.
Sorry, yeah, I just double clicked by mistake. Apologies,
right, okay.
Margaret. Thank you for that. I'd echo what you said, really. It's something that the fund I work with does, but there are challenges with it, and the challenges you cited are indeed have been present. Sometimes the trustee gets pulled into problems that might arise with the IFA. But there might not be the IFA's failure at all. It just might be the members' expectation as to what advice they should be getting, and their disappointment they're not getting the advice that they actually wanted or have been, looking to do. So, and that can be a disincentive. There's the cost element. There's the use of assets for that sort of thing, and whether that's authorised. There are a number of sort of complications around it, which make it a potentially tricky or at first glance hazardous. That said, we do find value with it. So it's there. Should we say there are some double edges to it? I think from our perspective, the positives still outweigh the negatives.
And Michael?
I think it's the other sort of triple-edged sword almost now, because there's a flip side in that I do have clients who have an IFA in place, who are there primarily for at-retirement advice, but the take-up is negligible, and sort of every time we report on how many of people have used it, the question is, why are we bothering? Because they're not using they're not using the house IFA. if they do, it's possibly only sort of part funded as well. How many trustees are going to pay the full £2,500, £3,000 for a full review of someone's DB pension as to whether it's right for them to transfer? So yeah, in principle, yes, there should be the independent advice available for scheme members. It's just a question of how many of them would actually use it to make it worth the trustees' while.
Thanks. I think it's actually showing that it's quite complicated. I see Simon Crystal has his hand up, and Simon is one of the good guys on the IFA side. Simon, your point?
First of all, thanks for saying that, Margaret. I always appreciate it when you do. I'm kind of minded not to take the debate too far in a different direction, because obviously this is about scams and the work that PSIG and you've been doing. But I think it was worthwhile just to add that, and I'm interested with Simon Grover being on the call as well, I think there's a communications gap between firms like ourselves who are advising individuals and trustees and more widely the employee benefit consultancies in what they can expect from us and what an experience should feel like. We try to say two things about ourselves. We talk to people in a way they understand, and we remove or reduce the barriers to people talking to us, and those two barriers are typically cost and trust. The advantage of being appointed directly is the trust, in that sort of sense. But there's this missing link in between being able to work with the trustees in the communications, modernise those a little bit, and particularly in relation to consumer duty, and to give a customer a real expectation of what it is that it'll feel like when they take advice. And that's, for me, is a gap. And that we're in the process at the moment with we're doing two things on two databases. We're building up with all of our stakeholders, and there are 87 of them, and they're typically trustees or employers, the pathway that each and every one of them takes to get from the first point that someone asks about retirement or a pension question to the point that they could end up with us. And we're also finalising our database on the different sort of people that come to us and why they make decisions, with the intention of sharing that with the industry as a whole. But we do think that there is a big communications piece here that is almost driving down the levels of engagement, and I actually think it comes down to talking about a pension transfer too much, actually, rather than what people are really interested in is how do I make my money work for me. So that was all I wanted to say. It's probably, like me, it's a bit long-winded, but I hope I got the point across.
Thanks very much, Simon. We'll move on, because I can talk nearly as much as you can. Probably not, but getting there.
Margaret, as a before we move on, I just wanted to say a couple of things, and I think it was touched upon possibly even on your last presentation. I think the biggest problem the industry faces is the fact that there is a little bit of distrust with the IFA community, which is, the unsaid word. I think IFAs have to survive and make a profit and pay their huge PI costs, so they need to charge clients. I think the general public, the consumer, the member, has a perception that an IFA is not of the same ilk as a lawyer or a surveyor or an accountant. And whilst I would shout all day long that they are viewed as not. So there's a lack of, there is a genuine lack of mistrust, genuinely, as an underlying thing. I think the most important thing as well is that the problem also with the FCA, and I'm trying not to put my head too far above the parapet, is that the problem is the way that regulation structured at the moment, and Alexander and Simon can back me up, I guess, is you've got to give basically holistic advice. There isn't this sort of diluted advice where people would just want some guidance or some signposting or some help. We talked probably about a year ago on a personal trainer at a gym. A person would pay 50 quid for a half an hour session at a gym. Why can't that happen in the financial advisor community? Because the advisor's got to do a full fact find and an appetite for loss and an attitude to risk and blah, 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 blah. And I just, do you think there is got to be a lot of work done to try and bridge the gap between consumer with the FCA, and I'm not saying this advice should be just willy-nilly, it's got to be done in a way, but surely that's a route that we've got to consider to try and change the regulations with the FCA's blessing to help real people with real needs who are perhaps on lower incomes. And that's the biggest point. And it's the biggest suffering, I think, is that a lot of people can't afford the £1,000, £2,000, £3,000 that an IFA will charge. I'll shut up now.
I do agree, but good IFAs, as you say, are, you know, a bit like other professionals. They have to, you know, train hard to get there. It's not just, you know, like, you know, build your muscles up and then you can be a fitness instructor. It tends to be, you know, quite complicated. But you are right, we don't sell it very well, and we have a tendency to make it all things to all men, and that makes it really challenging. I mean, if we look what members actually want, they want help. They don't differentiate between, you know, somebody giving them financial advice and somebody, you know, giving them a few hints and tips and what they should do, what their options are, etc. But I mean, I always go back to, well, not always, I'm not obsessed with the past, but I go back to, you know, 2012, looking to introduce a qualification on guidance for administrators, paraplanners, you know, people who aren't full IFAs, and it's not financial advice. And the aim was that it could never be regulated financial advice, but it could be help. Now that's just, I mean, it's available as a qualification with a PMI, but, you know, not too many people take it up. And again, it's because there's this fear that you might somehow inadvertently step across a barrier and be deemed to be giving regulated financial advice. And I think that's something we really have to, you know, get over, in a sense that, you know, helping is something that's immensely valuable. MAPS has a bit of a role to play there, whether it's through PensionWise or through the Money Helper service, and that's free, and it is impartial, but it's not advice. It's not telling somebody what to do. That's kind of dangerous territory, the way the regulations are at the moment. I see Simon has put his hand up, so kind of fairly briefly, Simon.
It'll be really briefly, and it'll be a conversation ender. I'm going to tell you how much I pay for PI every year, right? In this industry, it's 850,000. That's the PI bill that I get every year, right, for providing advice in this area. And I just thought, you made the point, Steve, about the PI, and you've made the point, Phil, about people exiting the market, right? You know, that in itself represents over 15% of the total costs of this business. So I just thought it was useful to give you that context, and then I'll shut up.
Yeah, no, it is actually, it's very important. I think there are a lot of dynamics at force around this, and what it's resulting in is, you know, less service to members than would ideally be wanted. But, you know, risks are there, and the way things are constructed, we seem to always be looking for somebody to blame, and I think that's a societal problem as well as a regulatory problem, and it's why we have lots of difficulties with claims management companies who are quick to leap on anything and try and see if they can get money, particularly on a no-win, no-fee basis. But I think these are all subjects for another session, because I think there's such a lot. In it. Shall we move on a little bit and just look at the interim guide, which is coming soon? Well, I've been saying that for the best part of 6 or 9 months, but really it is coming soon. And actually, I've got it in front of my desk at the moment. Just trying to get it over the line. But it's become very complicated. I thought it would be really simple, but it's turned out to be a bit of a moving feast. But it comes in 3 parts. basically. One is statutory transfers and explaining the regulations and explaining the issues with some of the flags. It looks at clean lists, it looks at risks, it looks at mitigations, and it also looks at the due diligence processes around the regulatory conditions, the 2 conditions that need to be met to have a statutory right, and identifying flags. But also, as we've heard a few times already, we look at communication requirements. The next section is on discretionary transfers, because there's quite a lot of emotion around discretionary versus statutory transfers. So we thought we'd split it out so that you could actually look at discretionary transfers more simply, and also look at clean lists and the due diligence that you need around a discretionary transfer decision. And the third section is around other things like data protection, management information, governance, reporting. So it's actually quite comprehensive, and it's become more like the code. And in fact, I'm sure the pages aren't terribly dissimilar to the code. A bit of good news is that Simon is working on a sort of brief leaflet, which gives you the key messages from the guide, so that if you don't want to read all 32 pages, you can actually look at the quiet room guide around that. So I like to think help is at hand. But looking at some of the key points, I would say due diligence is needed to make a reasonable decision, and it doesn't matter whether you're making a statutory transfer or a discretionary decision. And I think there's been a little bit of confusion thinking that people might use a discretionary transfer because you don't need to do anything. That's not the case. And making a statutory transfer might be your first approach. It might be your default because you want a statutory discharge, and you might just fall back on discretion to transfer where you really think the transfer is very low risk. So first off, statutory, if not discretionary. But for others, a discretionary transfer could be the starting point, and then falling back on a statutory route to stop a transfer that's perceived as high risk. So it's a different starting point, and that's usually quite common with insurers and even on platform transfers. But you've got to be very careful because your scheme rules might not give you discretion. And I was actually quite surprised to find out from Willis Towers Watson that 11% of schemes don't allow discretion, or only allow a very limited discretion. So that means a lot of schemes can't fall back on a discretionary transfer even if they want to. Another point is on clean lists. They are encouraged sort of in a side roundabout way by the regulations, but positively by the TPR in their guidance. And clean lists are good things. They do cut through a lot of scrutiny. So they're ideal for some, particularly where you make a lot of transfers, but not for everyone. If you only make a few transfers, there's quite an overhead to compiling and maintaining a clean list. But I think what's clear is we need to keep a risk-based approach. And as I've said before, the minority of transfers are scams. So, we really need to try and be proportionate and not hang up the industry. on things that don't actually cause a major problem. But as I've said before, the law is the law and we can't break it. But we do have to make sound decisions. But I firmly believe that faster and safer transfers are mission possible, not impossible. So where are we going? Well, as I said already, we've got a review of the transfer regulations. I know that lots of industry players have suggested things like carve-outs for the use of clean lists. That would obviously have to be caveated about the quality of a clean list, and also tweaking the definitions, which could be fairly simple, could also be very complicated, but could be pretty straightforward. And the PSIG code will be updated. It'll be updated to reflect, the regulations as they end up. But also we need to think about an overhaul of reporting, because it's too complicated, and we would certainly rather see a single point for reporting. And it could be action fraud, but it could be TPR, it could be FCA. It just needs to be one place instead of something like 6 as we have at the moment. And also what would be extremely helpful, and this has been a call since 2015, is positive support from the Pensions Ombudsman. We really need to know that the Ombudsman will be on the side of the angels if we carry out reasonable due diligence and make a reasonable decision. While there'll be no punishment for following the law, I'd like to think we could get lighter touch where people actually do follow good practice. And another thing that we're still trying to move forward is a scams intelligence database for the industry, and that's where the industry can look at a database to try and see if some individual is of concern to colleagues. And actually, I met with the pensions minister yesterday, and she was quite interested in how this could be pursued. So I think that's a positive sign. And of course, my old sort of bête noire is the unfair tax treatment of early victims who are somehow seen as being all knowledgeable and complicit when the truth is far from that. So that's something still very keen to progress. I'll stop again because I've got a limited view and there might be loads of people with questions. Yeah, Alexander again. I think you're
sorry,
on mute.
there we go.
Yeah.
Yeah, I'm just trying to get it off mute again. Sorry. I think that all chimed very much, I think, with a number of people here, Margaret. I think your comment there around taking a risk-based approach, and also your comment around interaction with the Pensions Ombudsman, are sort of two pieces of the same puzzle. Taking a risk-based approach is very difficult for a lot of schemes at the moment when we don't really have a full, clear perspective of the risks and how they might materialize, because we don't have any judgment or determination in this particular regime yet. We're still getting decisions from 2013, 2015, or not so much decisions, but cases from that era, and not so many, well, none yet from the new world. Hopefully, what I'd be quite interested to know is, has there been sort of liaison with the Ombudsman's office in terms of developing the guidelines that PSIG have been putting together? And do you know whether the Ombudsman is looking to accelerate decisions and determinations in this area to help provide some guideline, well, some fixed sort of determinations which help set the tone of how the Ombudsman would approach this?
Yeah, no, good question. And the answer is yes. We have engaged with the Ombudsman. we, in the interim period, just to make things more complicated, of course, we had a change in ombudsman. And I've spoken to Dominic, and he's interested in giving his background. I think he understands quite well the problems faced by the industry. Of course, the ombudsman has to follow the law, but the best thing, and as you've hit the nail on the head, the best thing is to get a determination, and TPO is accelerating a determination, and I expect one to come out fairly soon that is quite relevant. The problem for the ombudsman and determinations is, that people don't always know they've been scammed, or people, don't complain immediately. It sometimes takes a wee while to even get to the ombudsman's attention. But I understand that, there is a couple of cases have been interesting, but based on the past. But there is one expected fairly soon, which I think will help us. Well, fingers crossed. I'm hoping that's the case. But the Ombudsman is reviewing the final version of the guide. And I'm hoping we'll get some positive support from that. Okay, I think.
Margaret, can I ask a question about
this
is all about anti-scamming. So how deep in terms of the deep dive, people like Phil mentioned them earlier, Unbiased, Find an Advisor, even people like Trustpilot, maybe, I don't know. How easy is it to set up a shell scam advisor and join these panels and suddenly say, hey, I'm 5-star or Trustpilot or whatever? Is there any evidence that there's scamming going on with these referral sites as well for the consumers?
I think the answer is a bit mixed. Using Potluck, telephone directories, Unbiased, and a few other areas to find an advisor is actually Potluck. You have to make sure that they are properly sort of regulated, rather than just they happen to be on a compare the market type site, and you have to make sure that they've got permissions to advise you on the area that you want to get advice on. So it's very difficult. I think it's one of the hardest things for people to do, is to track down a very good advisor. But Simon, I think, is probably still on the call. Again, I'm harping back to the past, but we did actually put together a guide on how to recognise a good advisor, and we would like schemes, providers, etc., to at least refer people to that source, that guide. It's available on various websites, actually.
Yeah. Kevin, I don't know if you're to unmute, but Kevin's got a point there, which is part of that, Margaret, is asking normal people to undertake those exercises on their own back. Is that right, Kevin? Is that what you're trying to say?
Yeah, it's just, obviously there's an overlap between, I made the point of, if you go to a reputable advisor in the first place, then you're never going to be a victim of a scam. So, you can do all of the checks that you on the receiving vehicle and so forth that come through after, somebody's received advice. But it's more about getting people to that reputable advisor in the first place. And, we talk about people, you've made the point about going to Unbiased and so forth and what people should be looking for. And it's genuinely, how many people do we feel are equipped to do that level of DD themselves on an advisor? They see that someone's a financial advisor and think, right, okay, I wouldn't be able to do a level of DD on a surveyor that came to my house or so forth to make sure that they, actually had the qualifications that they said. Yeah. I just think it's a really difficult thing for people to do. And I'm interested why. I made the point earlier, or it was discussed earlier, about trustees appointing their own advice and so forth. And if cost is it a case of, if cost wasn't an issue at all? I'm asking trustees on the call, would they do that, or do they feel it's more risk to do signpost people to reputable advice than to just let them find their own?
I think I'll just jump in at the moment, and if anybody else wants to comment, I completely agree with you. It is actually very difficult for people to find an advisor, particularly, things like transfers are a one-off sort of decision. So it's not like you've built up a long and trusting relationship with a medical person or a lawyer or whatever. It is actually difficult. We did, as I said earlier, we did try to bridge the gap a little bit by creating a gold standard under the PFS umbrella, where IFAs could be listed on the basis of ethical behaviour and good outcomes, etc., etc. But there's limited take up of that, and maybe it comes down to making sure people know about it. But you're right, it's a bit like innocents abroad sometimes, and the FCA themselves constantly publish figures that show 50% of advice is unsuitable. Now that really tarnishes the whole market, and if we could quickly get rid of those bad actors, then the choice or the pool from which to choose would be a little bit more reliable, shall we say? But there are so many things at play in this, but yeah, I hate members to be left with sticking a pin in a directory. It's not great. And I see Philip has made a comment on the gold standard. It flicked up. I can't see comments, but it flicked up quite quickly.
Yeah, so Margaret, I was just making the point that the PFS represents the IFA industry, so it's the IFAs that pay the membership. So whilst gold standard is a great thing, unfortunately the PFS are not really the ones to actually judge their members because they're paying them their fees. There's a conflict there. Well,
I suppose that's probably akin to trustees taking a qualification from the PMI. You might actually say, well, that's marking your own sort of homework to some extent. But yeah, no, I understand. But it's one of those things. It's a bit like the PSIG code. Somebody had to do it, and Simon, being one of the good guys, stepped up to the plate to try and do something for his industry, and I think that's great. But I was trying not to say what Simon has just said, which is the spat between CII and PFS has caused a whole things to rot on the vine, which is another shame. But certainly the standard is available to be seen. But again, more on that. But I think there's a lot of interest in advice, guidance, and maybe that's another session for this forum.
Yeah. Margaret, we've got a few minutes left, and I did promise everybody a potential video. So, Simon Grover, are you ready to press play and hope that the video plays and the sound comes through to everybody? Because I think the video is rather good. And if you're a trustee or a provider, listen to this. And if you haven't seen it, enjoy.
Yes, I'll have a go right now. Video can be a bit jaggedy over a call, but I will post the link to YouTube in the chat afterwards. And yeah, this was a video that we made in-house at Quiet Room, just giving away for free. And there's a couple of dozen schemes and other organisations in the industry that are just hosting this on their website. So everyone's free to do that. So let's have a go.
Pension scammers are walking amongst us. At first glance, ordinary citizens going about their honest business, but all the time stalking their prey, preparing to strike. So how can we spot them? Where do they hide? And how can we avoid being suckered in? Many scammers lurk in telephones. They use these devices to offer you a free pension review, promising to get you your pension early or get you more than you get from your scheme. But you'll need to act fast, and we'd be a fool not to accept a free review, wouldn't we? Some scammers camouflage their darker purpose against the black and white of innocent paper. You didn't ask for this, so you suspect it might be up to no good. But enormous guaranteed profits sound like just the ticket. Don't they? Even amongst friends, the scammer lurks to seize the unwary. That friendly advisor that Martin knows says he'll buy you a coffee and explain how you can make loads of money by investing your pension savings in a new hotel complex they're building in somewhere or other. And it would be rude not to meet a check for coffee, wouldn't it? Their website looks professional. There are lots of clever sounding acronyms and impressive awards on it, and they'll get you more, or they'll get it sooner, or they'll get you both, but they'll get you. So stop. Before you do anything with your pension savings, remember these 3 rules. 1, don't be charmed. Free gifts, personal service, and home visits sound lovely, but real pension companies just aren't that charming. 2, don't be pressured. Don't act quickly or sign anything straight away. Advisors who are really on your side want you to take your time over important decisions. 3, find out if you're dealing with a scammer by contacting the Financial Conduct Authority, FCA. Their website has a register of authorized advisors. Make sure the firm you're talking to is on it. And if it is, make sure you're not talking to someone pretending to be them by only ever contacting your advisor using the contact details from the FCA register. Pension scammers want to take you for everything you've got. Everything you've worked for. Please, don't get suckered in.
There we go. So, general, any reactions to that chat? Anybody hasn't seen that? Thanks, Kerry, for the clap. Mike, you got your hand raised. Margaret's clapping. Margaret, any thoughts, Kerry?
I think it's very good, and it's the fact it speaks in language that members understand, and it's also quite funny. I particularly like the advisor being a member of SCUM. I think that's particularly good. But I would also say that PSIG has another video on its website targeted at trustees, which is by Ian Beeston. I don't know if he's on the call, but there's a lot of really good stuff, good collateral, and I think trustees ought to promote it a lot more to get awareness. I think it's particularly effective when it's in the language that the quiet room stuff is. Okay. Anything else?
Do we have any other further questions of Simon or Margaret? A fantastic session, Margaret, by the way, again. But if there are any questions, there was a comment. Is it? Oh, it looks like it may have.
Alexander's got his hand up.
Yeah, Alexander. Sorry, go on. Yeah, apologies.
So, just a quick one, Margaret. You mentioned some change in thinking around MAPS referrals. Was there anything further you can elaborate on that? Or?
Not particularly at this stage, okay. but there is a look at how perhaps the MAPS piece could be streamlined, because at the moment it's one size fits all. But also around how much do you tell members about the scam signs that you've seen. Could that be helpful to maps, or could it actually be dangerous? So it's amazing, even at this 11th hour, new things are popping up around it. So, you know, I was back in the biscuits last night, you know, just on that. So, but somebody, I noticed that somebody asked a question about when is the guide coming out, and at the moment it's targeted for the week commencing 13th of March. But we haven't had all the input yet, so it'll probably be a bit of a following the wind needed. But you know, we've got to cut it and get it out there at some point. So mid-March.
Fantastic. Thank you very much indeed. That's good. Are there any other questions of Margaret or anything to do with the anti-scamming process going forward? The only other thing Margaret was going to ask, by the way, was there's a pension scams action group, which is the regulator.
Yeah.
Is all going well there, or?
Yeah, it's actually I suppose a revamp or a reboot of the old Project Bloom, which nobody actually knew anything about, and it's still a multi-agency sort of group with key partners, and PSIG is one of them. But for the first time, it's got a little bit of a budget. It's got, as it says, action. It's got an action plan, a strategic one, and it's covering things like good practice, enforcement, awareness, victim support, which I think is terrific actually, and management information, and importantly, they're accountable. You know, the group is accountable to the pensions minister, and I think that might focus the mind. But having a budget, it's run by TPR, and they've got a lead person who's dedicated to this. I think it will help. So time will tell whether it works or not, but working together, trying to help the industry and members is absolutely essential. So we'll see how that goes.
Fantastic. Okay. Simon, thank you for the video. I think you've posted that in the chat. So if anybody wants to click the link, I think it's readily available on YouTube, Simon, I think, and it's free. So if you're a trustee or a scheme provider or an administrator or whoever, you could maybe plug this into your process. And to be fair, I know that in Beeston at Money Alive, they've also got an equivalent, which I think is also free. So there's some very, very good quality content there for consumers to take on board. And you know, if we can save somebody the embarrassment of losing hundreds of thousands of pounds, then it's a good job done by all. So well done, Margaret, and well done people like Simon and Quiet Room. So brilliant, really good. Margaret, thank you very much indeed for your time. Really appreciate your input, and thanks to Simon for the video. Next week we have Leslie Carline from KGC. We're talking about the role of administration and what's changing in the administration world for pensions, and that could obviously be you know, DB, DC, Master Trust and GPP. So quite a big session on pension administration, which we haven't covered for a while. So hopefully you can join that. Thanks again to Margaret. Thanks to Simon. If you like Playpen and you're not a member, please join. If you are a member and you like what you see, then please invite friends on the Invite Friends tab. And I cannot believe that this Friday will be 1 year for the Ukraine war. And we always say at the end of each session, let's pray for peace in the East. And also, you know, obviously very sad news about another earthquake in Turkey, so not good. But I hope everybody has a great day. Hope you've enjoyed the session. Really thanks for your input. And thanks again to Margaret and to Simon. So we'll leave it there. You should get your certificates very shortly. Thanks very much indeed. Cheers, Margaret. Thanks a lot. Cheers, Simon.